I recently bought Relative Food brand corn-free baking powder. I've used it twice, and both times the end product tasted like there was too much baking soda. So I'm testing it. In each cup is 10 grams of powder. On the left is regular baking powder, in the middle is baking soda, and on the right is corn-free baking powder. Looking at these, you can see that the corn-free baking powder is not pure baking soda, but it is not the same density as regular baking powder. Since American baking is done by measuring volumes, this shows that you do not want to use the corn-free baking powder as a one-for-one substitution in your recipe. Now I'm mixing the powders into equal volumes of filtered water. The corn-free baking powder is, once I start stirring it, is very reactive, and I keep stirring in hopes that I can keep the froth from overflowing. This frothing is something you would expect from baking powder, but I've never seen it froth this much before. Now, I eventually gave up on trying to control the froth, and I'm placing the spoon on top of the jar to help control the froth, but also so that I know which spoon was used with which sample. I don't want to cross-contaminate these things and mess up my results, but I gave up on trying to control the froth. Now I'm pouring in the baking soda into the water, and that just goes in there, and it just goes in, dissolves. There's really no reaction, there's no bubbles, and this is what you would expect with baking soda. And now the regular baking powder, when I put that one in there, it starts to froth and it starts to bubble too. It's not as vigorous as the corn-free stuff. I mix it in and it still seems, it's reactive, it's bubbling. Not as much as the corn-free, but had I had a small jar, it might have overflowed, but I'm not sure it would have because it's just not as vigorous as at reacting as the corn-free stuff. I let the solutions settle for 15 minutes to let them saturate in preparation for the next part of the test. Here I have pH indicating solution, equal concentrations and equal volumes, and I'm mixing in 1 teaspoonful of saturated solution that I made in the previous step. And then I just mix it up and watch the colors change. Now if the colors are exactly the same, that means the pH is exactly the same. So we'll see what happens when we add the baking soda solution, the saturated baking soda solution. Although I'm having trouble with the spoon right here, so I take the spoon off screen and I manhandle it a little bit to adjust it so that I can get 1 teaspoon a lot easier. There's a very small mouth jar. So now I'll take my teaspoon, carefully get it over there without spilling, pour it in, and stir it and stir it and stir it, and you see that it's a deeper blue. So it's more basic than the corn-free baking powder. So let's get this other solution of regular baking powder, and that spoon's needs a little bit of adjusting too, so I'm going to adjust it. And now I'm going to get back in there, get me a nice teaspoonful of saturated baking powder solution, and very carefully get it over to my indicator, stir it in, and give it a little stir to help everything mix up. And it's a fainter blue than all the others. So I'm going to bring them out so that you don't have put them next to each other so you can see the color comparison a little bit better. So the baking soda solution in the middle is the most basic. And if you put them side by side, you can see that the corn-free baking powder is really close in color, but slightly bluer than the just regular baking powder. So our conclusions is that Relative Foods corn-free baking powder is more reactive than regular baking powder. At saturation concentrations, it produces an ever so slightly more basic end product. And it is denser than regular baking powder, meaning if your recipe calls for 1 tablespoon of baking powder, you don't want to use 1 tablespoon. From eyeball measurements, I would recommend using a half a tablespoon or 2 teaspoons at most. For a baking powder that costs 6 times more than regular baking powder, you would think they could include this information on the packaging. This is the Airship Club, Wichita Falls, LLC. If you want to support our mission of building airships, visit us at airshipclub.weebly.com and buy a book.